The early morning of June 22nd, 1941, arrived without a sound. Only a slight tremor beneath the earth, the rumble of engines lined up at the border, and a dense silence that seemed to contain everything. At 3:15, that silence was broken in thousands of places, artillery firing in unison, armored columns moving through clouds of dust, radios broadcasting short orders in German and Russian. Dawn illuminated a 3,000-kilometer front transformed into a single blaze. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Wehrmacht advanced with methodical violence. On the other side, the Red Army tried to understand whether this was an attack or the collapse of the world as they knew it. That first light marked the beginning of a war that sought not to conquer a country, but to reshape the continent with fire and blood, and nothing was ever the same again. Hitler and the communist enemy from the east. Hitler did not envision territorial expansion as just another ambition within the party program. He conceived it as the biological and political foundation of the Reich. He formulated it before holding office, repeated it while still a public agitator, and made it a guiding principle of government once he came to power. That vision seeped into school textbooks, agricultural studies, and economic plans. The East ceased to be a foreign space and became a territory that had to be absorbed, administered, and populated. It wasn't an abstract slogan. It was a concrete project articulated by ministries and commissions that discussed population redistributions, production levels, and forced displacements. At the heart of this imaginary world was the Soviet Union. Hitler described it as a weakened giant, a political structure sustained only by state terror. He believed that with a decisive blow, this edifice would collapse upon itself. That interpretation ignored the country's scale, its capacity to mobilize immense human reserves, and its prior experience in rebuilding armies from scratch. But that miscalculation ended up being a strategic decision. Every analysis by the High Command from 1939 to 1941 was built around that premise. Even the pact with Stalin was interpreted as a temporary pause to allow for the elimination of France first. The goal didn't change, only the order. This political conviction was coupled with an economic urgency. Since the mid-1930s, studies by the Ministry of Economics had warned that Germany could not sustain a prolonged war without new sources of oil, grain, minerals, and labor. Previous campaigns had exacerbated the problem. Poland had required a massive deployment. Norway depended on a constant sea bridge. The British blockade was strangling reserves, and the military machine was consuming more fuel than the country could produce. The planners repeated the same scheme. Ukraine to balance food production, the Donbas to sustain industry, and the Caucasus to secure oil. Official documents formulated it with surgical precision. The war was to reorganize Europe to meet the needs of the Reich. Meanwhile, the USSR was moving toward rapid modernization. Intelligence reports mentioned new factories in the Urals, expanded railway complexes, and armored divisions in formation. Not all the details were accurate, but they pointed to a country undergoing industrial expansion. However, the Abwehr interpreted that information through an optimistic filter. It underestimated Soviet production capacity. The strategic depth of a country that could move its industry hundreds of kilometers, and the almost inexhaustible availability of new contingents. Hitler distrusted the analysts, but shared their final conclusion. If Germany did not act soon, the USSR would become invincible. The victory of 1940 reinforced this view. The fall of France in a matter of weeks fueled a sense of operational superiority that permeated all levels of the army. The combination of speed, surprise, and coordination seemed to have definitively solved the art of the offensive. Although some generals knew that success in the West had also depended on French failures and fortunate decisions, most interpreted that outcome as confirmation of a perfect formula. Hitler, who saw victory as personal validation, assumed that this dynamic could be repeated against the USSR. Prudence disappeared. The idea of attacking a gigantic territory ceased to be seen as a risk and became a natural continuation of what had already been achieved. But beneath that confidence, there were cracks. The Luftwaffe was still reeling from losses in the Battle of Britain. Truck production wasn't sufficient to equip the mobile divisions. Fuel reserves were strained and relied on vulnerable synthetic processes, and the German infantry remained, for the most part, a pack animal force, a limitation incompatible with a war fought thousands of kilometers from logistical centers. Even so, the operational plans insisted on the same time frame. The USSR had to collapse in less than 20 weeks to prevent the German economy from spiraling out of control. The political component completed the architecture of the attack. Hitler was convinced that continental hegemony would only be recognized if the USSR ceased to exist as a military power. He maintained that as long as Moscow had the capacity to influence the global stage, any negotiations with the United Kingdom or the United States would be secondary. The European order, according to his conception, had to be established first with a land victory. The rest would follow. For him, there was no separation between ideology, strategy, and economics. They were all parts of the same expansionist project. The fatal error stemmed precisely from that ideological construct. Hitler was certain that the USSR would fall quickly. The OKH's calculations, which predicted reaching Smolensk in weeks and Moscow before winter, fueled that confidence. The possibilities of an early winter, persistent mud, an excessively wide front, or an enemy capable of reconstituting entire forces were not seriously considered. No one imagined German divisions stalled by lack of fuel or logistical collapses. In those offices where maps lay spread out on tables with lamps turned off to conceal nighttime activity, Barbarossa was conceived as an inevitable conclusion, not as a leap into the void, but as the logical chapter of a foreign policy that had been pushing eastward for years. For the officers who submitted reports, the plan had already been decided before any discussion even began. They felt that the regime's structure was moving forward by inertia. Halting the project would have meant questioning the very foundations of the Reich. The path to invasion was laid out before the engines even started at the border. It was the product of a mixture of rigid ideas, material needs, poorly formulated diagnoses, and a military optimism fueled by early victories. The decision was neither impulsive nor a spur-of-the-moment gamble. It was the result of a cumulative logic that increasingly narrowed their room for maneuver. When the final order arrived, the Germans were no longer choosing to start a war. They were completing a process that had been brewing in the shadows for years. What the campaign would later reveal, the scale, the attrition, the winter, the resistance, was not included in any report, but in the regime's mind the course was irreversible. The dawn that split Europe in two. The early morning of June 22nd, 1941 was anything but ordinary. It was a sudden break in the routine of a border that until that day had breathed in silence. A low, thick fog hung over the marshes, muffling sounds and blurring the outlines of the trees. The Soviet guards, motionless at their posts, exhaled wisps of smoke that mingled with the mist, unaware that the calm was seconds away. It was just after 3 o'clock when the border ceased to be a boundary and became a target. At 3:15 a.m., a subterranean shockwave rippled across the ground. Then came another and another. Turning their gaze westward, the sentries spotted anomalous flashes filtering through the fog, bursts of light that didn't belong to a storm. Within seconds, thousands of German cannons unleashed the first wave of an attack stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Nothing was improvised. Every point had been photographed, measured, and marked by Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights. Soviet communication networks collapsed with unstoppable speed. Silent exchanges, severed lines, transmissions reduced to a white buzz. In less than 15 minutes, the western border was transformed into a series of isolated fragments, unable to determine what was happening just a few kilometers away. At Grodno airfield, the initial shock jolted the mechanics from their cots. They rushed to the runway amid explosions that ricocheted off the hangars. A MiG-3 tried to take off but barely lifted off before being hit by a swarm of German fighters. The plane crashed in flames, illuminating the dark tree trunks around it. The pattern was repeated at almost every airfield on the front. Parked aircraft reduced to burning silhouettes before their pilots could even start their engines. Ground contact followed immediately afterward. From the woods near Suwałki, the 3rd Panzer Division surged forward with almost choreographed precision. Columns moved through trees and trenches following memorized routes. The roar of Maybach engines thundered like a continuous line, clearing the way for the motorized infantry. Border bunkers burned on both sides of the advance, reduced to smoldering structures within minutes. At the fortress of Brest, the initial impact was simultaneous across multiple sectors. Dormitories, interior halls, and command posts were shaken as if the structure itself were a drum being pounded from all sides. An officer attempted to coordinate the defense by holding a useless radio, incapable of transmitting or receiving a signal. The fortress held, but it did so isolated from the rest of the front, trapped in a siege that dragged on all day without anyone being able to communicate its true situation. Further north, messages transmitted from Kaunas were lost due to destroyed links. Many Soviet commanders reacted blindly. They mobilized incomplete units, sent columns toward the borderline believing the attack would be localized, and instead encountered armored formations advancing at an unknown pace. The initial shock of the first few hours transformed into widespread confusion. Dust, smoke, burning vehicles, and columns shattered upon contact with the panzer divisions. In Białystok, the chaos escalated. Divisions that had received conflicting orders found themselves surrounded, unsure of the enemy's entry point. Liaison officers relayed vague phrases: uncertain position, unidentified movements, changing situation. Many commanders ordered retreats without knowing which way to go. Others decided to hold their ground, believing the attack would be brief. The German offensive exceeded all expectations and rendered any plan based on staggered resistance useless. On the roads leading to Minsk, entire columns struggled to rebuild a line that had already collapsed. Dust clung to uniforms and faces. Fatigue mingled with disorientation. From the air, Ju-88 bombers pounded key intersections, creating bottlenecks where tanks, trucks, and artillery were immobilized. The scene, broken advance, explosion, standstill, was repeated along the entire front. Despite the disintegration, pockets of resistance remained. In dense forests, isolated villages, or makeshift positions, small units of the Red Army engaged in intense fighting. Some KV-1s managed to damage German tanks in close-range engagements. These were acts of valiant resistance, but disconnected from one another. They lacked the impact necessary to alter the pace of the offensive. The psychological impact was immediate. The entire border was filled with plumes of smoke rising like visible signs of a total invasion. Years later, many survivors would describe that dawn as a moment when the notion of time shattered. Endless seconds, orders lost, comrades scattered without direction. The border had ceased to exist. For the German forces, those first few hours confirmed their expectations. A surprised enemy, collapsed communications, and an advance that on paper seemed flawless. But beneath the surface lay troubling signs. The depth of the terrain, the vulnerable routes, the exposed flanks, and the drawn-out supply lines were warnings that some commanders grasped immediately. Speed yielded results, but also risks that had yet to fully manifest themselves. The first day of Operation Barbarossa ended in undeniable success, but it also revealed that the scale of the enemy, the territory, and the attrition to come far exceeded anything any German planning had anticipated. The attack had begun with brutal force. What followed would no longer depend solely on the initial momentum. The scale of the war had just become clear. Advance until you break, June under fire and dust. On June 24, 1941, barely 2 days after the start of Operation Barbarossa, Army Group Center maps already showed advances of 80 to 120 kilometers. On the ground, these distances did not signify victory, but rather accumulated friction. On the route between Suwałki and Grodno, the 3rd Panzer Division was advancing at more than 30 kilometers per day, a pace that in peacetime only existed in carefully planned maneuvers. The tracks of the Panzer III, Ausf J and Panzer IV Ausf F1 tanks kicked up dense clouds of dust that reduced visibility to a yellowish film. That dust became embedded in the Maybach HL 120 engines, clogging filters and forcing them to stop at regular intervals. Technical reports indicated that around 30% of the vehicles experienced overheating. Progress was rapid, but every kilometer came at a price: wear and tear. In the Lithuanian sector, Hans von Funk's 7th Panzer Division operated in internal temperatures that easily exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. The crews worked breathing superheated air, precariously filtered by damp cloths. Fine particles remained suspended inside the hull, accumulating in nooks and crannies. The water canisters hanging on the sides of the tanks offered no relief. The liquid was so hot it was unusable. Behind them, the motorized infantry was beginning to lose contact. The regiments of the 18th and 24th Corps had lost dozens of horses, exhausted by marches that exceeded all expectations. Between June 24th and 26th, the 6th Army reported delays in almost half of its light artillery due to animal fatigue. The image of a harmonious advance was breaking down into columns that stretched out and broke apart every kilometer. Soviet resistance emerged in brief, fierce and concentrated clashes. On June 23rd, near Elitus, the 7th Panzer Division encountered the Soviet 5th Mechanized Corps. There, the Germans discovered that their shells did not easily penetrate the frontal armor of the T-34s and KV-1s. In the engagement, the German division lost 11 panzers. The Soviets lost more than 70 vehicles, many abandoned without fuel. The KV-1s withstood hits at less than 300 meters, forcing the Germans to flank them and attack from their vulnerable points. It was a short engagement, but enough to demonstrate that speed did not mean invulnerability. Between Grodno and Leida, the roads were clogged with traffic. BMW R-75 motorcycles tried to clear a path through ambulances, Opel Blitz trucks, and columns of Soviet prisoners being led to the rear. In some areas, the lines stretched for more than 5 kilometers. Engines were failing due to dust buildup in carburetors and gaskets. The Luftwaffe was flying between 1,800 and 2,000 sorties a day, neutralizing railway junctions at Molodechno, Lida, and Volkovisk. The explosions slowed Soviet movements but also created barriers that the German formations themselves had to cross shortly afterward, generating bottlenecks that took hours to resolve. The Red Army did not dissolve. It retreated, regrouped, and reappeared where it was least expected. Between June 24th and 26th, the Soviet Third Army attempted to establish a defensive line near Hrodna, but ended up split into 3 separate units with no communication between them. The 10th Army, further south, lost contact with Moscow. Its commander reported that several divisions had ceased transmitting altogether. The 11th Army in the north lost 60% of its vehicles in 3 days, many abandoned due to lack of fuel. However, in areas like Rasinii, the resistance reached extreme levels. A single KV-2 blocked a vital crossing for 22 hours, destroying 12 trucks, 4 anti-tank guns and 2 panzers before falling under direct artillery fire. Fuel became an immediate operational constraint. Panzer III tanks consumed between 230 and 250 liters per 100 kilometers under ideal conditions. On the dusty roads of June, actual consumption climbed to 350 or even 400 liters. Supply lines were stretched faster than anticipated. Some convoys covered up to 300 kilometers in a single day to catch up with the advance units. The logistics officer of the 4th Panzer Group warned on June 26 that if the pace continued, fuel rationing would have to be implemented at the battalion level within 72 hours. It wasn't yet a collapse, but it was a cause for alarm. The letters sent to Germany conveyed a constant sense of physical exhaustion. Many soldiers wrote with the paper resting on their rifle magazines. The phrases were brief: 30 kilometers a day, we don't sleep, there's dust everywhere. In the 9th Infantry Division, 43 cases of heat exhaustion were recorded in 3 days. Soviet conditions were even more severe. Rations reduced to 300 grams of bread, divisions without water, forced 20-hour marches trying to break out of encirclements that were already closing in. General Pavlov's Western Front was disintegrating in real time. Telegrams became incomplete before disappearing altogether. The villages captured between June 24th and 28th presented a recurring scene: abandoned houses with food still on the table, destroyed radios, unusable wells and civil documents hastily burned. It was a territory frozen in time, half empty. The Red Army was applying a partial form of scorched earth inherited from 1915. What could not be sustained was rendered unusable. Despite these tensions, the figures were impressive. In 1 week, Army Group Center captured around 230,000 prisoners and destroyed between 2,500 and 3,000 armored vehicles. By June 26th, the spearheads were less than 100 kilometers from Minsk. But the reports sent to Berlin left out something crucial. A third of the panzer divisions were out of service due to temporary malfunctions. A fifth of the trucks required urgent maintenance, and several infantry divisions were experiencing delays of up to 48 hours compared to their armored vehicles. On the ground, the existing infrastructure was beginning to stretch to dangerous limits. The arrows on the maps showed an orderly advance. Reality showed something else entirely. Machines pushed to their limits, exhausted men, and routes incapable of supporting the weight of a campaign of that magnitude. The operation continued to advance, but it advanced by eroding the ground. And in June, no one could have predicted the price those first cracks would ultimately exact. War without witnesses, orders that erase traces. The first weeks of the invasion were not defined solely by the speed of the panzer divisions or the collapse of the Soviet Western Front. There was another silent parallel process that accompanied each advance: the activation of a system of orders designed before the border crossing and intended to determine which groups should be segregated, who could be eliminated, and which people would disappear without a trace. On June 6, 1941, 15 days before the start of the operation, the Wehrmacht received the Barbarossa jurisdiction order signed by Wilhelm Keitel. Its content was as brief as it was absolute. Crimes committed by German soldiers against civilians would not be investigated, and any sign of resistance, real or suspected, could be immediately suppressed. The document circulated as if it were a simple internal regulation. It was not. That same day, under the seal of Geheime Kommandosache, the directive on the treatment of Soviet commissars was distributed. Its wording was terse and deliberately vague. Captured commissars were to be identified, separated from the rest, and eliminated immediately. The order avoided any operational details. Its vagueness functioned as total license. In the margins of a copy preserved in Freiburg, a pencil comment appears: "No further communication." That phrase summarized the logic behind many of the decisions made in June. When the German units crossed the Bug on June 22, the machine was already in motion. Regimental officers had received oral briefings from the IC, Divisional Intelligence, explaining that Einsatzgruppen A, B, C, and D would operate behind the newly secured lines. No formal channels of coordination were required. Non-intervention was sufficient. The campaign diaries contain brief mentions of their presence in towns such as Tychokin, Grodno, and Skaudweil. The usual phrase was always the same: special activities in progress. Along the roads in the Białystok sector, German troops found houses opened, documents partially burned, and furniture moved. Many inhabitants had fled, others had been rounded up by security units within a few hours. In a school used as a triage center, SD agents conducted interrogations based on lists prepared before the invasion. Internal memos mention 24 detainees, confirmation of 6 political cadres, and immediate evacuation. In that context, evacuation did not mean relocation. To the south, in the area of the 43rd Corps, a German captain recorded a specific incident in his personal diary. In Jalavka, he observed civilians being detained by newly armed Lithuanian auxiliary police, while the SD checked names against previous records. When he inquired about the legal basis for the operation, the response was, "Order of the Führer, executed by special mandate." No documents were presented, none were needed. That formula was repeated exactly in dozens of towns, reflecting an implicit permission that was above the conventional military hierarchy. In Kaunas, the arrival of the Wehrmacht coincided with outbreaks of violence from local groups. The German advance continued unabated, leaving behind scenes that few understood and almost no one attempted to explain. Some towns remained untouched. Others showed signs of mass arrests carried out by auxiliary groups. The 16th Army reported that elements outside the army are carrying out actions against individuals linked to the Soviet apparatus. This restrained and ambiguous phrase masked a process in which local forces and Reich agencies acted simultaneously, without a visible structure but with overlapping objectives. On the outskirts of Vilnius, Einsatzkommando 9 carried out operations that were not recorded in military reports. Only indirect evidence remained: roads closed, access points cleared hours later, areas declared impassable for operational reasons. When the 87th Infantry Division moved through the area, some soldiers saw civilians digging trenches under armed supervision. One non-commissioned officer wrote, "They were identified as partisans. I didn't observe any weapons." He didn't elaborate. The lack of detail was, in itself, a way of aligning himself with general instructions. In the vicinity of Brest-Litovsk, where the initial resistance had been prolonged, post-combat measures began to be implemented. The 17th Corps issued an internal memo on June 27th. Any person detained in the combat zone without uniform was to be handed over immediately to the SD. The transfer was completed within minutes. There were no forms or lists. In the vicinity of the fortress, separate groups of prisoners disappeared without appearing on the lists sent to the OKH. The Wehrmacht counted regular prisoners. The others were not listed in any records. As the panzer divisions advanced toward Minsk, reports from Army Group Mitte included a phrase that would be frequently repeated: Sicherungsmaßnahmen durchgeführt, security measures implemented. Their scope was not detailed. In places like Radun, Volkovysk, and Novogrodek, these actions involved the arrest of former Soviet officials, the expulsion of targeted families, and operations carried out by groups independent of any division commander. The troops observed these interventions but did not intervene. The structure operated in layers, a visible military front, and beneath it, a clandestine apparatus. The reports sent to OKH between June 24th and 30th contain almost no explicit references to executions. But the gaps speak for themselves. Some villages are listed as secured, with a registered population of 0. In others, the only mentions refer to buildings, wells, or warehouses with no reference to inhabitants. Human absence began to be integrated into the landscape of the offensive, not as an effect of combat, but as a result of decisions made prior to the start of the campaign. As the front approached Minsk, documents related to special operations increased in number, but not in accuracy. Military commands sent clean reports. Security units sent parallel reports to the RSHA. Between these two sets emerged a grey area where figures were missing, names disappeared, and the language avoided concrete verbs. It was a form of writing designed to leave a record without assigning responsibility. And by June 1941, when the advance seemed unstoppable, this form was fully integrated into the way the war was being waged in the East. When geography became the enemy, the first nights of the invasion revealed an element that did not appear in any operational planning. Territory, when it retreats, also fights. On June 27th, as the columns of Army Group Center advanced toward Minsk, the entire corridor between Lida and Baranovichi was illuminated by a glow that tinted the sky a dull red. It wasn't German bombing. It was depots, stations, and workshops set ablaze by the Soviets during their retreat. The wagons loaded with fuel burned with such intensity that the air above the road reached temperatures capable of forcing Opel Blitz trucks to stop, their engines overheating as they swallowed that scorching air. Smoke drifted through the pine treetops, turning the advancing Soviet units into a series of distorted shapes. Silhouettes moved forward against the light. Horses ran loose, and cables continued to crackle after falling onto the damp ground. Amid this situation, the 29th Motorized Division was partially disoriented when interference from the fires overwhelmed the radios. The nightly report summarized it without drama. Communications degraded by multiple fires, deployment reconfigured with a 2-hour delay. The rivers became an even more decisive barrier. On June 28th, the 20th Panzer Division reached the Berezina near Stolbtsi and discovered that the main bridge had been demolished. Debris of beams and planks drifted downstream like projectiles carried by the current, and the water carried patches of oil that glistened in the flames of distant structures. Engineers from the 49th Pioneer Battalion attempted to construct a temporary footbridge, working under scattered fire from the opposite bank. Only light vehicles were able to cross. The panzer divisions were immobilized for hours while, on the other side, Soviet columns tried to reach Minsk before the final encirclement. Further north, in the forests near Molodechno, night lost all sense of direction. The combination of ash and smoke blocked the moonlight and reduced visibility to just a few meters. The 47th Panzer Corps advanced with compasses in hand because the routes marked on the maps did not match what they found. Passable paths turned into muddy corridors, paved roads obstructed by rows of deliberately felled logs. In the distance, irregular detonations indicated that Soviet groups were destroying gates, workshops, and minor bridges to delay the enemy advance without engaging in combat. At the approaches to Minsk, the fires followed their own logic. Reefs of twisted metal marked the sites of former railway workshops. Mountains of blackened bricks indicated old warehouses. The Red Army employed a pattern of depriving the invader of everything they could use: tools, food supplies, machinery, vehicles. Every kilometer traveled increased the likelihood of encountering another blocked road or a blown-up crossing. OKH was pressing to close the encirclement before June 30th, but the systematic destruction made each section an unpredictable journey. In Novogrudok, the soldiers walked across ground covered with a mixture of ash and pulverized glass fragments. The wind carried fine clouds that clung to their skin and uniforms. The smell wasn't simply that of burnt wood. It was the chemical trail of entire incinerated depots. The 12th Infantry Regiment recorded the complete destruction of a railway crossing whose precision indicated prior planning, twisted rails, signals reduced to metal structures, and the blackened foundations of a small checkpoint. On the banks of the Svislach River, sappers discovered unexploded charges hidden in the abutments of a still usable bridge. They removed them as the Soviets abandoned the position without attempting to hold it. They left behind small arms, open ammunition boxes, and a radio dismantled piece by piece. The transmission book had been ripped out. That meticulousness, eliminating papers, braking equipment, destroying signals, revealed a type of retreat that left no information that could be exploited. During the advance of the 4th Panzer Group, fuel depots continued to burn for days. The red light they cast reflected off the soldiers' helmets, making it seem as if Minsk was burning before it was even reached. The air, saturated with particles, made breathing difficult. When the advance guard entered the suburbs on June 28th, they found a city with no visible population, demolished stations, tracks obstructed by overturned trams, depots reduced to steel skeletons. They hadn't taken a city, they had found an emptied space. Further south, in the 2nd Army's sector, the Pripyat marshes acted as a liquid wall. Roads that had been passable became muddy quagmires that trapped wheels and animals. Sappers improvised bridges with freshly cut logs and makeshift reinforcements. The advance was reduced to slow, almost stationary marches. Soviet units used the terrain as a natural defense. They withdrew without engaging in combat, confident that the terrain would do the rest. Some areas were sown with improvised mines, others riddled with sharpened wooden stakes intended to halt any advance. The fires themselves served as a signal to retreat. Outside Baranovichi, huge grain stores burned for 2 whole days. German columns had to advance with extreme caution to prevent sparks from reaching ammunition transported in open vehicles. The risk was so high that new measures were imposed: a strict ban on smoking while in motion, increased distance between convoys, and permanent inspections of tires and fuel tanks. Meanwhile, Soviet groups that hadn't managed to retreat employed minimal but effective tactics. Logs driven diagonally into the road to stop motorcycles, steel spikes scattered across dirt roads, and broken signs to force unnecessary detours. These weren't attacks that could halt an army, but they were tactics that bought crucial minutes. When, on June 29th, the German advance forces closed the encirclement on Minsk, the surroundings showed a fragmented city. Fallen poles like exposed bones, streets with layers of soot, structures reduced to charred beams, and several districts turned into a landscape of extinguished embers. What remained under German control was not an intact capital, but a territory shaped by the Soviet retreat. There, every fire, every destroyed bridge, and every blocked road had withstood more than any armed unit. Collapse of the Stavka, the Soviet implosion. The Soviet collapse did not erupt in a single instant. It accumulated like a series of faults that propagated from dawn on June 22nd and continued to grow for more than a week. By 4 a.m., when the first impacts shook the fortress of Brest, the Western Military District was already virtually cut off. Telephone lines, which before the invasion suffered sporadic interruptions, were down within minutes. Entire exchanges ceased functioning. Others emitted a continuous noise that rendered any attempt to coordinate forces useless. What appeared on German maps as a uniform advance inside the Soviet Union was a torrent of broken signals, units getting lost in their own retreat and commanders operating blindly. In Minsk, General Dmitry Pavlov's command post received conflicting reports. Some spoke of divisions fighting in sectors that had already fallen. Others claimed they were surrounded without knowing by whom. There were reports announcing massive attacks where the Wehrmacht had only deployed motorized reconnaissance. Each message seemed to come from a different front. Bureaucratic confusion grew as rapidly as the German advances. When Pavlov tried to contact the Fourth Army, the response was the phrase that would become emblematic of the day: "We can't locate most of our units." In the map room, several officers resigned themselves to using civilian atlases because the official maps were outdated or had disappeared during the evacuation. By the afternoon of the 22nd, the Third Army had ceased to exist as a unified force. Its right wing was still fighting near Suwałki. Its left wing was retreating towards Lida without any communication. The center had been out of contact for hours. General Vasily Kuznetsov was trying to get an overview by sending messengers on horseback because German artillery had destroyed the radios. The messages that returned were dirty, disorganized scraps of paper with terse warnings. Road compromised, units scattered, out of ammunition. None of them allowed for the identification of a continuous defensive line. The Red Army was fighting without knowing its own location. Deep within the front lines, the NKVD implemented measures aimed at restoring discipline. In Grodno, several soldiers were executed for retreating without orders. No official records remain, only scattered references in later diaries. The consequence was immediate. Mid-level commanders concealed the true situation for fear of being accused of cowardice. Entire units withheld their actual positions to avoid being exposed. The war began to be fought on the grounds of internal fear as well. On the 23rd, when the Germans crossed the Niemen River, the Western Front lost all contact with the 10th Army. Pavlov spoke with Moscow, attempting to project some sense of control, assuring them that his divisions were still fighting steadfastly. He knew that half of them were operating as disconnected groups. The transcript shows Stalin listening silently, with a distrust that permeated every word. On the Slonim Road, the remnants of the 10th Army advanced as best they could. Administrative personnel mingled with artillerymen, cooks walking alongside T-26 tanks that had run out of fuel. Many vehicles traveled without lights to avoid air raids. The road was littered with abandoned objects, helmets, ration boxes, unused ammunition, half-burned documents. The only significant offensive maneuver attempted by the Western Front occurred between June 24th and 26th, when the 5th and 7th Mechanized Corps tried to attack the 7th Panzer Division near Elytus and Lapel. On paper, it was one of the last opportunities to halt the German offensive. In practice, the attack collapsed before it even began. Fuel ran out, coordination failed, several KV-1s were immobilized by mechanical failures, and 2 brigades became entangled in the Borisov woods, exchanging fire under the mistaken belief that they were engaging Germans. The 7th Panzer Division resisted, reorganized its line, and the counterattack was reduced to a disorderly movement of armored vehicles trying to retreat without a clear direction. Meanwhile, the reports reaching Pavlov's headquarters were becoming increasingly contradictory. In Lida, a commander reported that his heavy artillery was inoperable because the depots had been evacuated without any prior notice. In Mogilev, a regiment received simultaneous and opposing orders: advance westward and retreat eastward. In other sectors, units burned their own maps before escaping, leaving them without references in terrain where the roads did not match any logical pattern. Messengers on horseback, a method the Red Army thought it had outdated, became the only reliable conduit. Many did not return. By June 28th, the encirclement of Minsk was virtually complete. Pavlov continued to claim that he maintained an overview of the situation, even though almost no subordinate commander was responding to his transmissions anymore. Stalin, convinced that he had concealed critical information, ordered his immediate dismissal. He was arrested that same day and executed shortly afterward. His downfall revealed that the collapse was not merely tactical, it had begun to devour the very structure meant to support the front. Inside the encirclement, tens of thousands of soldiers were trying to escape eastward. They advanced in small groups, crossing forests and swamps at night to avoid detection. Some carried radio parts they were trying to put back together. Others marched unarmed, picking up any rifles abandoned on the sides of the road. In the final days of June, the roads to Minsk were littered with exhausted soldiers, their uniforms caked in dirt, unsure of their command or their destination. They only sensed that the enemy was advancing faster than they could regroup. When Minsk fell on the 28th, the Western Front ceased to exist as a coherent military entity. What remained were isolated fragments. Officers without troops, companies without command, units that moved according to rumors or instincts. In several diaries recovered later, phrases appear that summarize the final state of the front. "I have no news of anyone. There is no ammunition left. We keep walking without knowing where we are going." That was the real collapse. It did not happen because of a single German maneuver, but because of the simultaneous collapse of command, communications, logistics, and internal confidence. By the end of June, no Soviet general could say with certainty how many of his divisions were still operational. Barbarossa had not only destroyed positions, it had uprooted the Red Army's ability to understand its own position. The greatest victory of the campaign, the siege of Białystok, Minsk. The encirclement did not begin with a direct clash or a dramatic order. It began when two columns advanced along routes that, unbeknownst to them, would converge at a point no Soviet commander could have foreseen. From the north, Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group descended with a speed that exceeded all previous calculations, overwhelming Grodno and Leida as if resistance had vanished. To the south, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group advanced after breaking through Brest-Litovsk, tracing wide semicircles through Slonim and Baranovichi. Between those 2 points lay entire bodies of the Western Front, still clinging to maps that spoke of continuous defences that on the ground had ceased to exist hours before. On June 24th, the first German reports mentioned cut routes and dispersing Soviet formations, but no one was yet talking about an encirclement. The only indication was that the resistance in the Białystok-Minsk corridor appeared inconsistent and fragmented. The roads were littered with abandoned equipment. M1936 cannons overturned in ditches, GAZ trucks stopped with their engines open, motorcycles dismantled amidst the retreat. Yet enormous masses of Soviet soldiers continued moving, unaware that the corridor through which they advanced was already the embryo of a trap closing in behind them. On June 25th, when the 7th Panzer Division reached Radoszkowice, the resistance encountered was intermittent and did not reflect the true proportion of forces trapped. Soviet units appeared as uneven fragments, divisions reduced to battalions, battalions reduced to weakened companies, companies barely able to hold a line of exhausted men. Each German advance eastward narrowed the access points, compressed the roads, and transformed long columns into groups searching for openings where none existed. The next day, the 26th, Hoth's advance forces broke into the Leida-Minsk axis from the north, while Guderian advanced from the south towards Baranovichi. The joining of the two pincers was uneventful. It occurred when reconnaissance vehicles heard German engines approaching from the opposite direction. The report recorded the exact time, 7:30, with an almost unsettling sobriety. At that moment, the pocket was sealed. Between 250,000 and 300,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped inside, unaware of their fate. Inside the encirclement, the terrain changed in nature. The roads were congested, riflemen mixed with artillery remnants, supply trucks advancing aimlessly, loose horses covered in dust. The Soviet divisions advanced toward areas where they assumed their defensive line lay, but every kilometer led them deeper into a center with no escape. In dense forests, isolated groups heated water over tiny fires, watched from a distance by German outposts. In other sectors, they fired into the mist, unsure whether they were responding to an enemy or to nothingness. On the roads leading to Minsk, the German advance slowed. The internal movement was so massive that the ground vibrated like a living surface. Several Reich soldiers described the same impression, a constant murmur of footsteps, wheels, voices, and exhausted engines echoing from deep within the pocket. An officer from the 20th Panzer Division wrote, "It's an entire army advancing aimlessly. They only see us when they're right on top of us." Some Soviets carried rifles without ammunition, others staggered along, others fled in confused groups. They had gone days without orders, water, or food. When the internal lockdown began, the Germans encountered improvised defenses, unsighted cannons, Maxim machine guns mounted on damp logs, trenches dug with cans and rifle drumsticks. The disorientation was so extreme that several Soviet units opened fire on each other, believing the Wehrmacht had infiltrated in disguise. The smoke rising from the fires in Minsk, visible from more than 15 kilometers away, worsened the confusion. The same feeling prevailed within the stock market. There was no recognizable direction, no clear exit, no way of knowing where the breakout was. On June 27th, the final tightening of the encirclement began. It wasn't a decisive battle, but rather a constant pressure. Panzers secured the main routes, infantry advanced through trees and hedges, and artillery demolished crosses and makeshift barriers to prevent any escape. Every Soviet attempt to break through eastward was met with lines of fire that appeared without warning. From within, the encirclement felt like a ring, tightening a little more each hour. By the 28th, the interior of the Kessel was a devastated space. Backpacks open in the mud, broken cartridge belts, blankets thrown about, artillery pieces abandoned in ditches, and a continuous trail of ownerless objects. The units that had once been divisions could barely muster a few men under a single command. In the Naliboki forests, the last attempts at a breakout dissolved into isolated shots, overlapping orders, and a final silence that intensified the defeat. On the 29th, with the encirclement fully in place, the capture of prisoners began. The process took hours and continued into the next day. The Soviet columns advanced in defeat, covered in dust, many without weapons or with unusable rifles. The Germans counted groups of hundreds moving in endless lines. The final number, approximately 300,000 men, could not be seen at a single glance. It was spread out over tens of kilometers, a silent demonstration of the collapse of the Western Front. The physical evidence of Operation Kessel explained everything. More than 2,500 vehicles destroyed or abandoned, hundreds of cannons dumped in ditches, burned out depots, smashed radios, partially charred documents. It was the physical evidence of an army that had ceased to function as such. When Minsk fell on the 28th and the encirclement was firmly secured on the 29th, the German map recorded what appeared to be their greatest operational success. But those who walked inside the ring understood a less glorious truth. There had been no spectacular victory, but rather a widespread collapse, an entire front trapped in closed roads, orders without a recipient, and thousands of soldiers dying without understanding where they had been defeated. It was not a brilliant maneuver. It was a gradual suffocation that, by the end of June, had wiped out the Western Front of the Red Army. The arrival of General Winter. The cold didn't enter the campaign like a sudden storm. It came as a presence that at first seemed distant, almost insignificant, and which in a matter of weeks became the most constant force on the Eastern Front. In mid-October, as the German units advanced toward Vyazma and Kalinin, the first night frosts began to strain the metal of the vehicles. Temperatures dropped to -5, then -10, and the Maybach engines started with a harsh whine that served as a reminder that the oil was beginning to thicken faster than the German manuals had predicted. The drivers pounded on the sides of the tanks with hardened gloves, trying to loosen the tracks a little before setting off. In some vehicles, the internal condensation froze within minutes. The windows became covered with a white film that wouldn't melt even with their breath. In the panzers of the 3rd Panzer Group, some crewmen found that even the panoramic periscope froze from the inside, forcing them to scrape it with their fingernails to see. In the makeshift camps, the soldiers discovered that the clothing they had brought was insufficient. The leather boots, designed for European spring, became rigid containers where sweat froze as night fell. The cold penetrated their coats, passed through layers of wool, and settled deep in their bones. On the first freezing nights, doctors recorded cases of mild hypothermia. By November, they began documenting amputations of fingers and ears. What appeared in official reports as non-combat-related losses was, in reality, winter advancing on men who had no way to defend themselves against it. In the 6th Army, battalion medics noted that some soldiers were waking up with bloody noses due to extreme dryness and the brutal difference between body temperature and the outside air. The horses sank into the frozen mud. The abrupt temperature change between day and night caused the ground to transform from thick mud to a brick surface that could not support the weight of the carts. On the roads east of Smolensk, some vehicles became trapped in thin layers of ice that suddenly fractured. The soldiers advanced cautiously, testing the ground with their rifle butts. The steam escaping their mouths formed dense clouds that hung in the air for a few seconds before dissipating. Each breath felt like an effort. In the Klin area, several companies had to dig pits by hand with the frozen metal of the shovels sticking to their gloves because supplies of wood to build shelters were not arriving. Winter also disrupted logistics. The fuel, stored in metal drums, thickened until it was almost solid. It had to be heated with makeshift braziers using damp wood gathered from the forests. The smell of kerosene mixed with smoke permeated the camps and clung to their uniforms. The Opel Blitz trucks took minutes to start, and when they did, they belched out plumes of white smoke that rose straight up, like geometric columns marking every movement. This visible trail made it impossible to conceal any movement. The Soviets learned to identify a German presence by the steam plumes rising from the engine clusters which warmed up at dawn. In the Volokholamsk area, Soviet batteries adjusted their fire solely by observing these motionless plumes that hovered for minutes at a time. The panzer tanks suffered too. Transmission oil partially solidified, rubber seals shattered like glass. The MG-34 machine guns, accurate and reliable in summer, malfunctioned when internal moisture froze in their mechanisms. Some batteries lost their charge overnight, weakened by the intense cold. The growls of engines trying to start could be heard along the entire line, a repeated sound that marked the beginning of the day. German manuals had a section on winter operations, but it was designed for Central European climates, not for temperatures of -20, -25, and, in some sections of November, -30 degrees. In the 10th Panzer Division, there were cases where the MG magazines froze together, forcing the gunners to warm them under their arms in order to operate them. The infantry advanced with reduced movements. Walking became a mechanical act. Lift the leg, suppress the impulse of the frozen muscle, plant the foot without slipping, repeat. The Kar 98K rifles had to be kept inside the coat overnight to prevent the firing pins from freezing. The soldiers slept with their weapons against their chests, trying to use their body heat to maintain some functionality. When they woke up, the metal was as cold as a tool left in the snow. Gloves weren't enough to accurately feel the trigger. The accounts repeatedly mentioned the phrase, "The weapon was alive in summer, in winter it was dead." In the vicinity of Kaluga, the 258th Infantry Division recorded that some bolts had to be opened by striking them with stones picked up from the ground. The Soviets, on the other hand, moved with a familiarity the Germans couldn't replicate. Their padded uniforms, designed to withstand extreme temperatures, seemed insignificant at first glance, but they made the difference between operating effectively and merely surviving. Outside Klin, Soviet patrols glided across on makeshift skis while German troops advanced, their boots sinking into the fresh snow. In the forest, the Soviet movement was swift and almost silent. The German was clumsy and lumbering. The contrast was stark even without fighting. Some German units noted that the Soviets appeared and disappeared among the trees without leaving any visible traces, something impossible for soldiers carrying European equipment. When temperatures dropped below -30, winter became a weapon. Artillery shells exploded with less force due to the rigidity of the metal. Lubricants turned into thick pastes that hampered the recoil of the cannons. The radios were constantly malfunctioning. Insulated wires would snap and require repairs that could only be done by removing gloves and exposing hands to freezing air for minutes that felt like hours. Some operators suffered frostbite on their fingers, leaving them numb. Communications, already strained by the distance, began to fail unpredictably. A message meant to convey an urgent order would take minutes, sometimes hours, to be sent. At the 9th Army, operators noted that some messages never arrived, probably because the equipment shut down on its own during the night. In the occupied villages, winter also took its toll on the structures. Wooden houses creaked under the pressure of the ice accumulated on the roofs. Chimneys smoked intermittently because the damp wood barely caught. The frosted roofs were illuminated by the dawn light like glass surfaces. The Germans took refuge in barns or abandoned schools, but the cold seeped in through the cracks and left a thin layer of frost on the blankets. Those who slept near the walls awoke with their clothes frozen to the outside boards. Breathing was painful. Speaking too. In some settlements, soldiers had to burn Soviet furniture to heat their stoves because the local firewood wouldn't burn. The animals were the first to fall. Of the 600,000 horses the Heer had deployed in the operation, tens of thousands died during the first weeks of freezing temperatures. Their bodies lay stiff in contorted positions, their manes hardened by the frost. The smell of frozen meat hung in the air along some of the roads. Without horses, the light artillery lost mobility. The Germans began leaving pieces behind because there was no way to move them. It wasn't a tactical decision, it was a physical necessity. In the Klin region, an entire battery of 105mm guns was abandoned when the horses died in a single night. Winter also altered direct combat. Soldiers fired less because each shot raised a cloud of steam that revealed their position. Fallen bodies froze in minutes, immobilized in the position in which they had fallen. Summer uniforms offered no protection. Snow clung to the fabric, melted with body heat, and refroze. German soldiers walked with layers of ice stuck to their trousers and boots. Every movement made the fabric rustle like torn paper. In some sectors, the Soviets waited for the steam from German weapons to betray a position before firing a single shot. By the end of November, the German offensive was no longer progressing as planned. This wasn't a command decision, it was winter imposing a limit. Vehicles were taking hours to get moving. Machine tools in the forward workshops weren't responding. The ammunition was handled with care because the metal crackled under the gloves. Night marches became impossible. Day marches exhausting. The Soviets, accustomed to this climate, began to move better and faster. Winter was not merely an atmospheric phenomenon, it was a player, an operational factor as decisive as an armored division. When temperatures plummeted to -40 in some sectors of the front, the campaign ceased to be an offensive. It became a fight for survival. And this new kind of warfare, in which the cold fought more relentlessly than any army, found Germany unprepared, lacking adequate equipment, and without the logistical capacity to adapt. Winter had arrived slowly, but with a force that transformed the Eastern Front into a scene where every minute of life was an act of resistance. And for an army that depended on speed, nothing was as devastating as a climate that rendered speed a useless concept. Moscow and the battles that stopped Hitler. The advance on Moscow seemed inevitable in the first days of October. The German offensive had broken through the Soviet front at Bryansk and Vyazma, trapping hundreds of thousands of soldiers and leaving an impression of collapse that stretched across the map. Operationally, the campaign seemed to be returning to where it had begun: speed, deep penetration, flanking maneuvers. But the terrain was no longer the same. The Red Army still existed, scattered, deformed, but intact in its capacity to mount resistance. More importantly, the season had changed, and with it, the type of warfare. Snow fell on the German vehicles as the mud from the previous month suddenly hardened. The tracks, still worn from weeks of marching, became stiff. The engines, which until then had performed under a regime of constant wear, began to fail at dawn. The cold opened a new front that wasn't on any map. It wasn't a symbolic enemy or a simple climatic obstacle. It was a phenomenon that disrupted the functioning of weapons, engines, human coordination, and operational plans. Every kilometer toward Moscow began to demand an effort unparalleled in June. The advance eventually became a series of minor setbacks. A tank that wouldn't start, a bridge that collapsed under the ice, a company losing men to frostbite before even entering combat. On the outskirts of Volokholamsk, the Soviet resistance used these lulls to rebuild a layered defense that combined regular units with militias, remnants of destroyed formations, and troops brought in from Siberia. This seemingly improvised patchwork worked because it faced an enemy weakened not only by distance but also by accumulated attrition. For the Germans, every day of delay amounted to a silent strategic loss. Their logistical reserves were not growing while the Soviet ones were. What Moscow represented was not merely a failed battle. It was proof that blitzkrieg had a physical limit. Until that moment, German doctrine had been based on continuous movement: penetrate, encircle, reduce. But to encircle the enemy, mobility was needed. To move, reliable machinery was required, and to sustain it, a logistical chain was essential, one that couldn't maintain a 1,000-kilometer advance without breaking down. Moscow was the point where that doctrine ceased to function, not because the Germans were incapable of fighting, but because the terrain, the weather, and the enemy no longer allowed them to use their own methods. The defeat at Moscow marked the end of the fundamental myth upon which the campaign was built. That time was on Germany's side. To the south, the battle for Rostov revealed a different kind of turning point. Rostov was the gateway to the Caucasus, a geographical point that determined Germany's access to the oil resources it needed to sustain a long war. Taking the city was not simply about advancing. It was about securing access to the Don River and opening the route to Maikop and Grozny. When the 1st Panzer Army entered Rostov at the end of November, it did so under hostile conditions, in a city that was defended not by lines, but by layers. Factories destroyed, basements occupied, positions hidden among ruins. That type of urban combat exhausted an army that depended on movement, not frontal attrition. The German withdrawal a week later was more than a failed counterattack. It revealed the operational limits of Army Group Süd. The enemy they faced was no longer the one that had retreated in June. It was an army that had learned, reorganized, and reinforced its lines with units from the Caucasus. The Soviets were no longer fighting to contain the German advance, but to recapture territory. Rostov was the first place where the direction of the campaign shifted, and its significance was immediate. If Germany could not hold a key city like Rostov in winter, how could it hold a front stretching from the Arctic to the Black Sea? Rostov made it clear that the German army was under unsustainable strain. The offensive toward the Caucasus was delayed not for lack of will, but because it was recognized that material attrition had reached a critical point. With the loss of Rostov, Germany lost the initiative in the south. And when an army that relies on the initiative loses it, its entire operating system becomes more fragile. Rostov showed that the campaign could not continue to expand without a price that Germany was not prepared to pay. Further north, history seemed frozen in a still image. Leningrad surrounded, cut off by land, bombarded relentlessly. The siege transformed into a parallel war within the larger campaign. It was neither an offensive nor a defensive front, it was a front of absolute attrition. For the Wehrmacht, Leningrad represented something it had never faced before, a city that continued to function under conditions that would have destroyed any European administrative structure. Factories produced munitions, civilians dug trenches with their bare hands, and traffic across Lake Ladoga, first by barges, then by ice, kept alive a city that should have surrendered according to all German calculations. The German defeat at Leningrad did not result from direct combat. It occurred because their plan to starve the city into submission failed. Every day Leningrad resisted added a layer of attrition to Army Group North, which was forced to remain in static positions, subjected to extreme weather, unable to advance or retreat. Leningrad became an unwitting anchor for Germany, a point where it could neither win nor retreat. The city paralyzed the northern flank, turning it into an immobile mass that consumed resources without producing any advance. The three defeats, Moscow, Rostov, and the failure of the complete encirclement of Leningrad, were not isolated events. They formed part of a single process, the transition from a quick war to a long war. Moscow thwarted the possibility of destroying the Soviet state in one fell swoop. Rostov prevented the opening of the route to the Caucasus and showed that the Red Army could recapture a major city. Leningrad absorbed forces that Germany needed on other fronts and revealed that Soviet resistance was deeper than the planners had anticipated. Operationally, these defeats meant that Germany could no longer direct the war, it could only react. Logistically, they demonstrated that the Eastern Front was too large to be sustained with the available resources. Psychologically, they showed the German soldiers that distance was not just a space they had to traverse, it was a mechanism of attrition. And strategically, they demonstrated that time, that factor which Germany had used as a weapon, had turned against them. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht still controlled vast regions of Western Soviet territory. But the campaign had changed in nature. The offensive was no longer an operation. It was an extension of the front beyond its actual capacity. The defeat at Moscow broke the advance. The loss of Rostov broke the initiative. The resistance of Leningrad broke the logic of the Blitzkrieg. Together, they transformed Barbarossa into something Germany had not foreseen, the beginning of a war it could not win in the time it needed, nor with the resources it possessed.